Oh, sorry, I've just switched off. Yeah, so it's actually quite nice to, kind of delve into some of the different aspects of the site and kind of, get to kind of come along and tell you all about it. And hopefully if anybody's not already been down to the Reed Beds, then it'll encourage you to head along. So I'm just going to give you a quick rundown of what I plan to cover tonight. So a bit of an introduction, talk about the history of the site. Some of that's quite interesting and kind of gives a bit of an insight as to why it is the way it is. The management that we undertake there, and there's a little hint of that in the photo on the side, the species that we are managing for, some of the monitoring that we do, what is the future of the Reed Beds, something that we're always asking ourselves, and a chance to ask any questions you have. And yes, if you've got any about Canordy or Loch Leven, chuck them in the mix as well. So just for anybody who doesn't already know where the Reed Beds are, so I'm just moving everybody's photo so I can see the slide. So this is where the Reed Beds are. So there's about 11 miles of Reed Beds stretching along the north bank of the river between Dundee and Perth. So the Reed Bed, we kind of talk about, so it's the largest continuous Reed Bed in the UK. And there's not that many great vantage points where you can see the kind of the scale of the Reed Bed, but it is a phenomenal site. And the Reed Bed does need remeasured, but the last kind of figure that was bandied around was about 410 hectares. So it's a significant size. As I said, largest in the UK. And the RSPB has around 260 hectares of reed. So we don't manage the whole of the Reed Bed. It's all owned by lots of different individual landowners, as well as the Crown Estate as well. So we manage, as I said, about 260 hectares. And we also manage about 400 or 500 hectares of mud within the estuary. And it's kind of under our management, but as you can imagine, we don't actually do any management out there. It's just kind of under the reserve umbrella. So this is what it looks like. So we've got, it's all Phragmites australis or common water reed. And you can kind of see it at various stages of growth, got the fresh shoots, and then the very tall reed, which can kind of be 6-8 feet tall, as well as kind of an idea of kind of the density of some of the stands of reed within the bed. So this section of the Reed Bed that you see on your right hand side, this is one of the deepest sections of the Reed Bed. Some of them are kind of a lot narrower, so maybe even kind of only 30 meters from the bank, whereas this one is significantly larger, which does it means it's a really good area to try and get in and manage. But it also, in terms of monitoring, anybody, obviously Jeff, if you've been kind of at the Tay trying to do some monitoring, obviously it can be quite tricky if you can't kind of get very clear views of the river itself. So that's kind of one of the challenges that we have, is kind of getting really good handle on what is actually on the reserve. So the reed itself, or the Reed Bed itself, was really, although there might have been some reed there originally, a lot of what you see is not kind of a natural reed bed. So you can see in this photo here, so sorry, I'm pointing at the screen, but I realize that you can't see me pointing at the screen. But you can see these lines coming out from the bank and into the river, kind of at either side of the photo. And these are the dikes. So these were established, and the stone was brought from downriver at Kingoody. So it was brought up, and these dikes were built out into the river of the Tay. Kind of using almost like a Dutch polder system, and this area was allowed to silt up. If you look at aerial photos or OS maps, you see a whole series of these dikes built up, and then obviously it was allowed to silt up, and this was because there was a lot of tidal erosion of the bank on the north edge of the Tay. So then the reed was either established or helped to establish, and this is what has really protected the bank. If anybody kind of walks along the passage, there's quite a height difference between where the river is and the bank, and you can see some areas where there's obviously been kind of more inundation in the past. So so the reed bed has kind of been helped along in a way. It's not entirely natural. So and also you can see kind of in this photo here that the reed bed hasn't come all the way out to the end of the dike. It's obviously the tide or the action of the river has kind of prevented it from working its way out. So although I said that the reed bed is about 410 hectares, it is, in some areas, it is kind of creeping out into the Tay, so it's not kind of reached its full extent in a way. And it will depend on how the tides change and how the silt accumulates in the river. In some areas, it does seem like there is still quite a significant shift in silt, and that will obviously kind of affect the shape of the reed beds in the future. So in terms of management, so the reed bed has been managed since about the 1800s and used for various things, so including thatch, but also some of the material was used for livestock bedding, which I can't imagine would be very pleasant, as well as kind of in field drains. And I believe during World War II, some of it was even used to make paper when there was a shortage of trees. So it's kind of been, it's been used for a long time, but certainly in the last, what would be the last 50 years, it's really only been cut and managed for thatch. So as I said before, each kind of landowner at the top of the bank owns that section of reed bed that runs out into the river. So it's not owned by any one person, everybody kind of has their own little chunk. So probably over the years, different landowners would have used it for different purposes. But in the 70s, by the 70s, there wasn't any management at all. So obviously it kind of fell out of favour for a while, and there wasn't really any large-scale management. As I said, a little bit was used for paper making, but actually most of it was kind of quite redundant by that point. So it was actually in the 70s that there was two thatchers came up from Somerset, and they'd obviously kind of heard about the reed beds and they'd taken a look for themselves, and they thought it would look like very good quality reed. So by the mid-70s, they'd kind of moved up and they'd set up shop to basically start cutting thatch. And that's really when the commercial management started at the Tay. I'm not really sure what the scale of it was back in the 70s, but yeah, I mean, I would imagine they didn't have quite as big machines as these. So this machine that you see in front is the Sega. So we don't have this machine anymore, but that's basically what's been used to harvest the reed on a large scale for quite some time. And the pictures in front are actually so we've got Graham Craig who's driving the machine, and he has managed, so he worked for this original company and then took it over in the early 90s. And as you can imagine, as material is transported, from mainland Europe and a lot of other areas, like China and Russia that are growing thatch, the market kind of changed essentially. And it just didn't really become it wasn't financially viable to kind of keep managing the reed beds in the same way. So that's why the original company folded, and Graham kind of took it on and he opened up new areas. So if anybody has kind of knows the reed bed quite well, anytime you're down, you can see the areas that have been managed on a regular basis. The reed is quite a lot thinner. I mean, it still kind of grows as tall, but the structure of the reed bed is quite different. And that means that, there was a lot of areas that hadn't been managed for a long time, and the quality of that reed is quite poor, essentially. So what Graham did was he went along and he opened up a lot of the areas that hadn't been managed before. And that meant he kind of went in and he would, obviously there's trees kind of wash up off from the river at high tide. They get stuck in the reed bed, and obviously that can be very difficult for the machinery. So he went in, he cleared a lot of areas. A lot of the areas that were very dense, he burnt them. He did some controlled burning to clear areas. And I think by the time that Graham was winding down, so at one point he was able to cut up to 60% of the reed bed. So it was just a phenomenal scale of operation, and he had 3 machines on the go, and at least 3 other men working with him. Would be at least another 5, because it was 2 men per machine to drive the machine and stack the reed. So it was a very big setup. But again, even with Graham's setup and managing quite a large area, it wasn't really commercially viable. So by kind of 2004, 2005, Graham was winding down and looking to kind of stop the management. So that's when the RSPB basically got involved. So you can see kind of some of the management blocks there and some of the thatch that's been cut. So that's it essentially ready to be cleaned, the bales that are sitting there. So it's not ready to go on a roof yet, unfortunately. Still a long way to go in the process. But the RSPB, we obviously saw that the management was very important for the wildlife. So although it maybe wasn't commercially viable anymore by 2005, we were very keen to not see an end to the management. Again, it's not as if the whole reed bed needs to be managed, but certainly in order to prevent it all becoming quite dense and stagnant and not really suitable for a whole range of the species there, we just wanted to keep a certain level of management. So we got involved and we took Graham on as staff. So he actually stayed for another 10 years, which is really good because, as you can imagine, with a site like the Reed Beds, a bit of continuity is definitely a good thing, but also it's a very tricky site to manage. It looks kind of more straightforward, from the air when you look at aerial photos, but actually there's some very deep gullies in there. There's some very soft bits of ground and soft bits of mud. So it was a huge advantage for us for having Graham, who understood the whole process, but also knew what bits of the reed bed you could go into, and more importantly, what bits you couldn't go into. So the area that we took on to manage kind of changed from what Graham pretty much managed as much as he possibly could along the whole stretch. Anywhere that you could get a bit of machine into and extract some reed, he was in there. He had reed stacked all over the place. Whereas we were just interested in having some management, but we didn't necessarily need the same scale of operation that he did. So the boundary that you see in front of you is actually our current boundary, and that's it's changed over time. So we've kind of gained some bits of the reed bed, and we've lost other bits, just kind of as things naturally evolve. So this is kind of our makeup at the moment. So the boundary that you see, obviously, that isn't all reed bed. So some of the big chunks that are sitting out in the river, that's the mud flats that I was talking about earlier. But most of our effort is basically focused around how do we manage the reed? How are we as effective and efficient as we can possibly be? It's not, we would like to make money from the operation, but we're also realistic that the scale that we're doing it at, it's more about prioritizing the management and maximizing that rather than trying to make an income from the site as well, although that would be a very nice bonus. So this is what we do. So Graham would cut just massive stretches, and that is the most effective and efficient way to do it if you're looking to cut thatch and you're looking to make money. Whereas because we're managing for specific species with different requirements, we were really looking to create a mosaic within the reed beds. So these maps here are management maps from last year. So they're maybe not that clear depending on the size of your screen, but each block is an area where basically a machine went in and cut the material. So some of it was cut for thatch. So the green blocks, they were cut and material was removed from the site. The orange blocks, they were cut and flailed. So that's just going in and chopping up the material and leaving it on the bed. And one of the really important things that we're trying to do is just create a variable edge structure. So although the site is tidal and there is some natural, I suppose, breakage of the reed there isn't enough kind of variation that we're getting naturally. So I think the original plan when we took on the reed bed was that we would want about 7 years worth of age structure within the reed bed. But actually that is an absolute nightmare to manage. And having tried to make that work, I'm okay if we don't try to do that. It's quite the headache to have 7 years worth of maps and try to manage different blocks at different times. But the important thing is that we don't let it stagnate. So it's important to kind of have a diverse structure, but also it prevents scrub establishing on the bed as well. Again, you can see in aerial photos, and you can see if you're on site as well, there is scrub coming up in different areas. And that's partly because it grows on the dike as well, but also, once the plants get in, they kind of get quite well established. And this is the machine that we're using at the moment. So the machine that Graham used, I kind of inherited that when he retired, but it basically needed to retire when Graham did. It needed a lot of money spent on it. And I think it was so unique to Graham that nobody else really had a chance in figuring out how to drive it. So we actually use a contractor at the moment, and this is the machine that they use. So this is a soft track, and they basically drive along like a combine, cut the reed in these bunches that you can see in the bottom of the screen, and then they kind of pack them in bales on the back of the soft track and carry them in a sled. And then they get stored in a shed, and they have to be cleaned. So once they come off the bed, they still need to be reprocessed before they're suitable for going on a roof. And that means that every string has to be cut, and all of the bent reed, all of the broken reed, any leaf off of the reed needs kind of removed, and then it gets retied and recut. So it's a very kind of time-consuming process, and it's very labour-intensive and expensive, and hence why Graham retired, because it was very hard to make money from it. Certainly at the scale of the operation, even with 3 machines on the go, Graham couldn't kind of make it work financially, and I think there is a real push at the moment for the use of local materials. So we've been contacted by Historic Environment Scotland, because obviously they're really keen to see properties in Scotland that were traditionally thatched with reed. They want that same material to be used again, and they want to make sure that there is a supply available. And the Tay Reed Beds is the only site that is commercially producing thatch. So although we're a much smaller operation than it used to be, we are still it in terms of Scottish reed. So as much as it would make my life an awful lot easier if we didn't cut thatch at all, I think we are very much still keen that it is very much part of the cultural makeup of the site, and it has been for a long time, and we don't want to see that come to an end. So we are looking at ways to kind of make that a more viable setup. And if I'm honest, we haven't found the perfect solution quite yet, but we're ever looking out there to see how to make it work a little bit better. But the main thing is that the demand is there, and certainly this was basically the reed that was cut last year. And it all got sold. Some of it went out to Tay Reed, some of it went out to North Uist as well. So there is a real demand, but again, people quite like the idea of having a thatched house, but it is a very expensive kind of thing to have, I think. So, and one of the thatchers who asked me about some of the reed that's about to be cut this winter, he said that once he told this homeowner what it was going to cost him to rethatch his house, he just decided to sell his house. So although there is the demand, it is still hard to find the money just to cut the reed, to put it on the roof, to find a thatcher to put it on your roof. It's just very expensive from start to finish. but we get other benefits from it as well. So we're not, as I said, we're not interested in it just because we want to see thatch production continue. We're interested in it because of what it does for biodiversity. So obviously we're managing for specific species. So the RSPB has a whole list of priority species. We've got our top 44, our top 101, and these are the ones that, that are either particularly struggling, or they're particularly under threat, or they will be under threat, and that we can make a difference for. So in terms of the Tay Reed Beds, these are our 3 priority species. So we've got beardy tits, we've got water rail, and we've got marsh harrier. So, and they all require something quite different from the reed bed. So beardy tits, so one of the things is about managing the blocks. So although it might seem a little bit pernickety in a way to do all these blocks like you saw on the map, it's really important for the beardies to have a mix of older reed to be able to nest in, and then the younger reed that's a lot more open and they can forage for insects in, essentially. So it's really good to have the 2 side by side. And we did have, he now works for the RSPB as an ecologist, but we did have a student at the time doing a PhD on the reed beds, and he was kind of looking at what is the optimum, where are the beardy tits using. He put little satellite trackers on the birds, and he tracked them, well, there were radio tags actually, and he tracked them on a daily basis to see what kind of areas they're using. Are they using the older reed or the younger reed? And he could see that there was, that kind of interface between the old reed and the new reed was really important. So they were moving quite a lot between those 2 areas. So from that, we kind of, we determined what is a perfect block size. So we kind of go for about 0.4 of a hectare, with about 30 meters in between. And I mean, obviously the beardy tits, they're not out there with their measuring tape checking that we've made the block sizes quite right, but it's just, it's a rough idea. We don't want it all to be a cookie cutter approach, but it's an idea of what we can try, and over time, obviously, we can monitor changes, monitor how they use these areas. We can try different things. We can go up a block, down a block. We can kind of chop and change. And again, with the reed beds, the size that we have, we can try different things. But it's good just to have a good middle point to aim for, that isn't too onerous to try and achieve. Because I think that's the thing when we're working with a contractor, year in, year out. You don't want to be asking them to go in and manage tiny little blocks. It needs to be realistic and it needs to be achievable. So that's kind of where we're at the moment. But we do know that this having the mixture is really important for beardy tits. Whereas for water rail, they really like a mosaic as well. So they quite like the edge of the reed bed, so almost where the reed bed joins onto the bank. And the bank is quite steep, but because of the way the bank is, and quite a lot of it is clay, there's often quite a lot of water kind of pooled around the edge of the reed bed, and quite a lot of grass coming up as well. So they quite like that type of habitat, bit of dense grass, some stagnant water or slow moving water as well. But they also, you quite often see them, I mean, you hear them more than you see them, but the tracks that are left from the vehicle going in and out and managing the blocks, you quite often see them in there, because the tracks, although they don't really damage the rhizomes of the reed, they do kind of create these little pools of water that are kind of nice and muddy, and the water rail kind of makes use of them as well. And also, if the reed is too dense for the water rail, they can't really kind of get through it. So they're quite nimble birds, but the reed can be very dense if it's not managed at all. So again, we kind of want to create this mixture so that they do kind of get the denser material that they need, but they are able to still maneuver through the site. And then the marsh harriers, they'd be quite happy probably if we didn't really do any management at all. They quite like nesting in the old reed. So we can't, because the site is all designated, so So there's different stipulations that we have. So we can't manage within 10 meters of the riverbank or 10 meters of the river. So there's always quite significant buffers that will never have any management. And within that, we only manage up to, so I think our consent at the moment, we can only ever manage up to 20%. We will potentially go over that in the future, but there will always be significant areas of reed that will never be managed. And this tends to be where you find the marsh harriers. And they create these very dense nest platforms within the reed bed. And they kind of use the river edge and the fields as well up on the bank. You see them kind of scanning over and feeding quite a lot. And certainly when the blocks within the reed bed that we've managed are still open, they're able to hunt a little bit easier in there as well for any prey that might be scurrying around. So these are our 3 target species. And I should say as well, so the reed bed itself is also a priority habitat for the RSPB within the UK. And again, it's obviously particularly important in Scotland because there's not a lot of reed beds, and there certainly aren't any of the same scale. But they are, they're under risk, especially tidal sites such as the Tay. We're kind of, we do kind of keep one eye on the future and think, well, how will sea level changes affect the reed bed? And obviously then how will that affect the species that are in there? And if there's anything that we can do to kind of mitigate that. But I think just certainly for the moment, by continuing to manage the site as much as we can and as favorably, we're creating very robust populations of these species, as well as all the other birds that are using the site as well. So the Beardies, so in terms of kind of how they're, sorry, I'm just trying to think, how are they doing? So I'm just going to come on to monitoring actually after this, but this is obviously, this is a pair of Beardies. So I have done a bit of bird ringing, but I don't, these are not my hands, unfortunately. So, but the Tay ringing group does quite a lot of ringing at various points throughout the reed bed. So I think this is one of my first ringing sessions there, and I was pretty blown away by getting to see the birds up close, because they are phenomenal little birds, and they do zip along. And I think there's just been such significant interest in people trying to see the bearded tits, and I've just had some phenomenal views just in this last winter. And again, if anybody kind of knows the reed bed, chances are you'll have been down to Tay Lodge, so the section of the reed bed that's just south of Errol. And the bird ringers have been there quite a lot recently, and they've got a grit tray. So because the Beardies, they eat invertebrates during the spring and the summer, and then in the winter, because obviously the invertebrates are in short supply, they switch to eating the seed off of the reed, and that's when they need to ingest grit to help them break down the seed. So obviously the ringers are baiting up grit trays to try to encourage the birds to kind of come to this one area. And if you've been down when they've been ringing as well, then you'll know that they play tape lures just to try and call the birds in as well, just to try and get as good a catch as possible. But yeah, they do move around in some quite large flocks, and I've seen some quite big numbers this winter particularly. It tends to be when I'm actually trying to survey for them, they're not there. But when I'm just out for a wander and I'm not interested in counting them, they're just all over the shop. So yeah, I've never seen it as busy. But yeah, there's been a lot of photographers and bird watchers down in that area recently. But yeah, so that's the place to be if you want to see bearded tits. And as for water rail, so as I said, they do like to kind of skulk around, hear them a lot more than you see them. You do, yeah, sometimes you just hear them right at the bottom of the bank, but I've hardly ever had a glimpse of them at the Tay. But there's quite big numbers of them down there, and they're very kind of secretive birds, and they do nest in the reed bed. And sometimes, if you're lucky, kind of sometimes in the tracks from the machinery that have kind of been left out flat in the reed, you do occasionally just see the little scurry of some water rail chicks, the little kind of black furry blobs kind of zipping about. But our ecologist that did his PhD on the beardy tits of the Tay, unfortunately, I couldn't find it. I was very disappointed. But he had this phenomenal shot on a trail camera of water rail predating a beardy tit nest. And it was just incredible. I think of them as predators, but, never really would have thought that they would have been a significant impact on the beardies that nest there. But I think probably everything gets a chance to pick off a beardie if they can. So very, very small and easy to find, I think. And then you've got the marsh harriers as well. So as I said, so this is one of their quite dense nests. So I went out with Steve Moyes, who's one of the ringers, and he kind of takes charge of bringing the marsh harriers out there and has done for a long time. So this was a nest from a few years ago. So most of them are tagged. So it tends to be a different colour every year. So you maybe have seen birds around. Certainly, up at Kinnordy, we've had tagged birds, as well as down at Loch Leven. They do move around quite a bit. And unlike the other species, the marsh harriers do ship off in the winter, and that's when they tend to spread out. So I think the furthest afield that Steve's had a report, it was at Senegal. So there's some significant movements, but actually a lot of them do still just hang around in the UK in the winter. But there are surprisingly few reports of ringed and tagged birds. But this was a really nice brood of 4. But they're quite ugly, I think. Sometimes I just can never get over quite how ugly they are. But still very, very nice to see. But yeah, very much kind of a very hidden site. The amount of effort it takes to find a nest is just absolutely phenomenal. So the ringers are very determined, and I think obviously they have to be in terms of pinpointing where the nest is. Which brings me on to monitoring, actually. So one of the really important things we do is try and obviously relate our management back to how well the species are doing. Of course, that's pretty much the foundation of what the RSPB does. We're very driven by the science. But as you can imagine, just about every species at the reed beds is really difficult to monitor. So we have we've got a few different systems in place, essentially. So for the bearded tits, so we do vantage point surveys. So we've got the map there with all the little dots on it. So each dot is a vantage point survey, or a vantage point rather. And each point we spend 5 minutes listening and watching. And so we're listening to see how many birds we think they are, as well as kind of any visual. Invariably it's a fly through, but and that kind of gives us a contact rate. And then at each point as well, we note if it's within 100 meters of a managed area, and then we can kind of, obviously you need quite a lot of data to be able to correlate that, but we can look for trends between where the majority of the birds are, along with how important the management is. We used to do it in April, May and June, but because quite a lot of the vantage points have trees in the way, it means that actually you lose any ability to see the birds. So now we just do an April and a May survey. Although, as you can see from the graph there, it's quite variable, and it does indicate a downward trend. But I should say that we don't actually believe that's the case. So bearded tits are very boom and bust, and they can have multiple broods in a year. So they can, if they have a bad spring, they can recover quite well the following year. But one of the downsides with doing the vantage point surveys is that it's just an absolute snapshot. So, and we're very much tied to when the weather is right. So it has to be a sunny day and a calm day, because you need to be able to see the birds moving as well as hear their call. And that means that you can just absolutely hit them at the wrong time. So if you hit them, if you go out and do the survey at a point where a lot of the birds are incubating, then of course you pick up hardly any activity. So last year, I don't particularly enjoy early mornings and early starts, but which is when these surveys are. But last year, our ecologist asked us to go from 2 surveys to 4, which hurt quite a bit, I have to say. But we did really get some good results, and it meant obviously the window between the surveys was a lot smaller. And although it maybe doesn't look like that on the graph, that's because it's kind of an average of the 2 surveys that we did in April and an average of the 2 that we did in May. But actually the results were an awful lot better, and 3 of the surveys were very buoyant, and then by the later survey in May, the numbers had kind of dropped back down again. So I think that's what we're going to continue to do for the next few years, certainly, is do the 4 surveys, see if we can try and get something that's a bit more representative, because in terms of kind of breeding season, it can be so variable from year to year. So kind of, I think we need to be open to trying different survey methods. And also I think when when you're trying to record birds that are maybe 50, 60 meters away, and from a brief glimpse determine if something was it a beardy tit or was it a reed bunting, I think obviously the more surveys you do, the more reliable that data is going to be. So that's kind of where we are. Obviously there's a bit of an indication of a downward trend there, but we are still pretty confident from the ringing data, which I'll come on to in a minute, that actually the beardy tit population is doing very well. So in terms of water rail, so you can see all the little dots on the map. So that's where the surveys were done last year. So the surveys were actually done by Steve Moyes, who's part of the Tay Ringing group, and he was one of the people that devised the water rail monitoring method, and it's a callback method. So it's basically at each of these dots, it's playing a very loud water rail call, a deafening call for, I can't remember, it might be 30 seconds. And it is a really unpleasant survey to do. And then you switch off the call, and you have kind of 2 people standing, let's say 20 meters apart. And then you wait to hear what calls back, basically. And then you kind of triangulate to get an idea of how many birds are calling back. Excuse me. So last year, actually, so Steve did a section at Tay Lodge, so at Errol, so that's kind of in the bottom section of the map that you can see. And so that bit of reed bed hadn't been managed for a long time, and we just took it over in 2018. And Steve did a survey of one section of that just after we took over management. So it wasn't late enough that any birds would have had a chance to move in. And he only picked up 13 pairs in 2018, and we've been managing it consistently since. And he picked up 42 pairs last year. So although it's not a full site survey by any stretch of the imagination, so we'd need a lot more data to be quite confident, but it does seem like the birds are responding well to the management and have moved back into that area. As I said, it hadn't been managed for a long time. They find it difficult to move through the denser reed, and it's obviously less attractive to them. So they really, really hadn't been using that area for a long time. So obviously we're quite keen to continue that management. And then it's a sort of, it's the kind of data that makes us very keen to spread our management out throughout the reed beds. So it's quite easy, we have maybe some money, it's easier to just go into one section. But we want to make sure that doesn't happen. Even if we only do a little bit of management, we want to make sure it's spread around the reed bed as much as possible. And that means that we, I suppose, don't put all of our eggs in one basket. for want of a better phrase, but also it means if we get an event such as the fire that we had 2 years ago, it means that not all of the population is affected in one. Hopefully we're creating a more robust population throughout the length of the reed bed rather than just focusing all the management within a very small area. But yeah, so the water rails seem to be doing well. So I think the plan is to do a repeat survey, as well as trying to do a whole site survey at some point as well in the near future. And that's because you obviously you can't tell, is that an increase in the population because of the spike that we're seeing, or is it that we've actually just pulled in birds from another area? So we really need to do a full site survey to get a better idea of what's going on there. And yeah, so as I said about the monitoring of the marsh harrier, so it's all about trying to find the nest. So I put in this photo here because in terms of the marsh harriers, they have a very dense nest platform and it's really difficult to find. But the really mind-blowing bit about it is that although Steve is on the north edge of the river and he's trying to obviously work his way in through the reed beds with a group of people, it's actually somebody on the south side of the river that's guiding them in. So there's a guy called Harry who I've never met because he's always just been on the other end of a radio. But as long as the marsh harriers are kind of starting to pair up and starting to build nests, he's been watching from the south side of the river, at a phenomenal distance, trying to pinpoint where the nests are. So that's obviously, how far along the river they are, as well as how deep in the reed beds. It's just phenomenal. And the group that go in and ring the chicks, essentially they have a small arrow on a very long pole, and Harry's on the other side of the river with a telescope, and he's going left a bit, right a bit, or turn a little bit to, turn 90 degrees and walk for 10 meters. So he's guiding the group of people in from a huge distance, and trying to gauge what direction this little arrow is on the stick. And you wouldn't think it would work, but every time I've been out to a nest, which isn't for a wee while now, he's always guided us bang into the nest. And then obviously the chicks go, the chicks kind of scatter and then you have to grab them. But it is kind of incredible. And there was 5 nests on the Tay last year, just on the reserve. So as I said, there are bits of the reed bed that aren't on the reserve. So it's quite likely that there was pairs kind of elsewhere on the Tay, but the Tay chicks they weren't quite as productive last year. There are other marsh harriers elsewhere. So there's a pair up at Kinnordy. There's other ones that breed in Angus and Perthshire. And I think for whatever reason, the other birds actually were a little bit more productive. I'm not quite sure what happened at the Tay, whether it was just timing with the cold snap in the springtime maybe affected the chicks. But yeah, hopefully they will kind of bounce back next year. But yeah, so at least 5 pairs on the Tay, which is quite nice. So they're consistently nesting at the Tay. And I'm trying to think when they first nested there. Yeah, it's been a few years anyway. So, but yeah, there's not a massive increase in the population in Scotland. There's probably still only 10 to 15 pairs of marsh harriers, and the majority of those are at the Tay. They do seem to be spreading out, and down south, obviously they nest in farmland as well as reed bed. But all the ones that I'm aware of in Scotland are all nesting in reed beds, which obviously limits their opportunities somewhat in Scotland. So, but yeah, a very nice bird to see. So other monitoring that goes on. So the ringing group, they've been ringing at the reed beds for longer than the RSPB has been involved. So they've got quite a long history. They've been there probably since at least 2000. I'm not quite sure how much before that. But yeah, so they've been ringing consistently there. And and were there before the bearded tits arrived, which I think was in the 90s. And they set up a RAS scheme, so that's ringing for adult survival. And that means that every month, I can't remember, maybe from April through to September, I'm not quite sure, they're out at each of 4 different sites along the reed bed for a certain amount of time every month, and they're looking at recaptures. So obviously they're ringing any new birds, but they're also looking to see on how many adults that they're recapturing, so how much recruitment is coming into the adult population. And then there's some phenomenally complicated data crunching that you can do to equate that to a population size. But the error bars, so the amount of confidence there is in those figures is quite variable. The last figure that I saw, which I think actually came out of the PhD, which was obviously based on a lot of old data, was probably about 400 to 450 adults within the Tay. So it's very much thought to be the largest population of bearded tits within the UK, which is kind of what you would expect from the largest reed bed, but it's not necessarily how it goes. So we haven't had a chance to kind of crunch the data in the last couple of years. But yeah, I mean, it seems like it is a very strong population. And as I said, they are quite boom and bust. So there are definitely, dips within the data, if they have a poor spring, if it's really cold and wet during the breeding season when the chicks have hatched. So it means that, they can bounce back, and having that consistent data set provided by the ringing group, it is essential. As I said, the vantage point surveys that we do are very much a snapshot, but you get the detailed, you get the month by month data from the ringing group, but you can't just look at it and tell what's going on. It takes quite a lot of investigation into the data to be able to draw any conclusions. And obviously the ringers, they catch all the birds that are moving through the reed beds. The dikes, unfortunately, the photo that I've put in is kind of a little bit washed out, but you can just almost maybe make out one of the nets that is set up. And this is actually on one of the dikes that runs out into the river. So these stone dikes are at various points, and that's where the ringers are setting up their nets. So they've got bamboo poles, and then they kind of stretch the nets between them. So any birds that are moving kind of from one side of the dike to the other across the reed beds get caught. So obviously up towards the tree line, you get a lot of, other non-reed bed specialists. You get a lot of blue tits and dunnocks and a whole range of things, and the odd woodpecker. And then obviously out towards the river's edge as well. The river's edge can be quite a productive bit in terms of catching beardies, because they quite often fly along the outer edge. So it tends to be more of the reed bed specialists that they're catching. And throughout the year as well, kind of in the autumn, they do hirundine roosts as well. So they kind of put on some lures as well to bring in the sand martins and the swallows, so they can catch quite big numbers in there. So the ringing group are a phenomenal resource, and they're very dedicated to the reed bed. And although the RSPB, we do, obviously we do some monitoring. The ringing group are phenomenal in terms of the amount of data that they can provide, and they have a very long data set, which is quite good to kind of look at changes over time as well. So there's the webs as well. So we don't actually do any webs counts on the Tay. We have just started helping with the low tide webs counts in the last couple of years. But in terms of the regular webs, there's actually one very large vacant section. So you can see on the map, there's kind of the yellow blob and the purple blob. And the purple blob isn't counted at all, and that's because access is actually really difficult. It's very difficult to get vantage points for some of the sections of the river. So the webs doesn't count the reed bed. It counts it counts what's out in the river and on the estuary. but just the reed bed is such a dense and extensive feature that actually makes it very challenging to see what's in the river. So for the last couple of years, we've been, so we as in the RSPB, so myself and our two assistant wardens, Amy and Darren, we've been helping with some of the low tide webs. So that's the bottom map there. So we're counting these 10 sections, and that's just kind of 4 months from October through to February. So we've got another one coming up soon. And that was last done in, I think, in 2012-13. So that's not an annual occurrence, which I'm quite glad about, because it's a very long walk and it's very difficult to try and see the birds. But some of the views you get are phenomenal. So that photo there is almost at the most westerly point of our section at Kearney Pier. And you get some phenomenal views, obviously, when the tides are low, and if you can get into the right position, it's a very beautiful sight for sure. I have to be honest, I haven't really picked up very many birds on the sections that I've been doing. They do tend to be more towards the east end of our section, and I don't know whether that's as much because it's just shallower and there is more mud available, as well as it's just a much better vantage point. So maybe we're just missing lots with where we are. But you can't really tell, but this is a white-tailed eagle. So unfortunately, I was already gazumped by Jeff there on saying that there was a white-tailed eagle, but this was the view that I had on the last low tide webs, which I was very pleased about because I hadn't seen one for a while. And there were two there actually, and there'd been two on the previous low tide webs, but it just sat around and didn't do anything at all for the whole 10 minutes that I watched it. I was quite disappointed, but yeah, if you do get a good view, and not necessarily of the eagle, it is phenomenal. There was hundreds and hundreds of curlew in my section the last time. It was just, it was a fantastic sight. So but yeah, it's some hard fought views, I would say, at certain sections. And then we do, so it's not all about the birds. There's some other monitoring as well. So CC, which is the Scottish Invasive Species Initiative, so they are working on a few different catchments within Scotland, but they're doing monitoring of mink within the reed beds. So there did used to be a mink farm at Errol. I can't remember what the time scale was, but certainly there is a mink population, and they are within the reed beds. They have caught a few in the last few years, which is really good news. But yeah, they're always going to be there or thereabouts. So it's really about kind of being vigilant and trapping where we can. And then, actually my photos have overlapped each other, but the picture behind is some giant hogweed. So there's quite a lot of invasive species, I would say, at the Tay. There's certainly some big stands of hogweed, as well as Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam. So that is one of the things with the Tay being such a big catchment, that in terms of the plant species that might be affecting the site, if there's not enough control upriver, then in some ways there's not much point in us trying to control stuff, because actually very quickly it washes back downstream and recolonizes. But it is something that we're monitoring. And I know CC are, they're working up the catchment at the moment. So I'm hoping at some point they will kind of work their way down to our patch. And then there'll be some good eradication programs going on. But that's just a few of the invasive species that are kind of around, but it is something that we are aware of. We're obviously aware of not trying to increase any spread, but just try to monitor what is happening to them and try and get involved with any larger programs, because it's quite inefficient for us to go in and manage small patches if actually everybody else around us is kind of not really doing their bit. And then kind of one of the biggest I suppose developments, but not in a good way, at the Tay was the fire in April 2020. So just at the start of lockdown, really. So we are just kind of keeping an eye on how that section of the reed bed has been affected. So it's about 120 hectares of reed that were burnt. So it was kind of all over the news, and some incredible shots of the helicopter dumping water on the flames. And it was just very unfortunate with the timing being kind of late April. A lot of birds would have been kind of on nest by that point, certainly had clutches. And it was just, I mean, the damage was just phenomenal. Basically, there was very little left. You can see in the photo there was little pockets there. And actually, when I went back to the site the next day, a lot of the beardies were just, moving around and just clinging in to these little patches of reed that were still standing. It was quite a depressing sight. But fire is a management tool that is used in reed beds elsewhere. It's just, it wouldn't be done during the breeding season. So obviously we're kind of monitoring to see how the reed bed is recovered. And actually, although the fire was in late April, by August, the reed was back, and you wouldn't have really known there was a fire at all. It recovered phenomenally well. So in terms of the reed, we're not particularly concerned with how it's affected the actual plant itself. It's just unfortunate that, as I said, we're trying to create a mosaic of different age structures. So we want old reed and we want new reed, and then obviously the fire kind of comes along and resets everything. It kind of puts it all back to year dot again, and you're starting from scratch. So over the coming years, we'll be looking to kind of reintroduce that mosaic. So leave some areas untouched and manage some areas on a kind of annual rotation. As well as, we're obviously interested to see how the species, how the bird life returns. A lot of species would have been affected and they wouldn't have gone on to continue breeding that year, particularly the marsh harriers. We think at least one, if not two nests were affected. So we're interested obviously to see if birds are returning year on year, if there's any long-term impact on the population. We doubt that will be the case, but it's something that obviously we want to be aware of. And also, looking at, if there's much chance of, fire damage happening again. We don't know how the fire started. It was, the police and the fire services kind of put it down as accidental, but it was pretty devastating for us, and we just want, if there is anything that we can do to prevent it in the future, then we'd be quite interested in investigating that. And the future. So what is the future for the reed beds? This is the old reed harvester and the youngster that is used on site at the moment. So we've got kind of two quite different setups. But I think long term we might look to buy more machinery to bring the control back in-house. So the moment we kind of use a contractor, we just get in for the winter to manage the reed beds, whereas we don't have the same level of control that we'd like. So we might go down that route. We're definitely, so this winter we're opening up a bit of the reed bed at the west end of our reserve that's not been managed for at least 15 or 20 years. So it's it's very unproductive in terms of being good for wildlife and for biodiversity. It's all very kind of stagnant and very unappealing. So we're going in there and we're doing some management this year to try and improve that area. So I think it's more about doing more of the same and doing it better, and trying to make sure that we spread our management out throughout the reed bed as much as possible, as well as doing a bit of future proofing and seeing how we can kind of maximize it, as well as trying to look at the balance of managing for thatch as well as for biodiversity, because I think it's in some ways it's two quite different things. You can achieve the same goal, but by managing thatch we have to manage the same area year after year, whereas the areas that we just kind of go in and chop up, or we flatten the reed to encourage reed growth, we've got a lot more flexibility within that system. So that's something that we're looking at the moment. What is the right balance between these two kind of systems? yes, we're not going to stop managing the site in the near future. It's just more about how we go about it. And that's me. So thank you very much for listening. I realise I have gone over the time, but apologies for that. And yes, I'll be interested to see if you've got any questions at all.
Thank you very much, Vicky. That was fascinating and marvellous. A couple of comments. You talked about finding the marsh harrier nests in the reeds, but perhaps you understated the difficulties, did you? Reed beds are pretty impenetrable in places, and possibly the nests aren't in the wettest, muddiest areas, but there's these natural hazards, apart from the sheer difficulty of finding the nest.
Yeah, there's some very big gullies in the reed bed. That tends to be one of the biggest problems. If you can get past putting the whole of your body weight on the reed to break it, as well as avoid getting poked in the eye or cut by the reed, then yeah, quite often you meet these big deep gullies that are 6-8 feet deep. And actually, I did wonder when I first went out why we were carrying a plank, just a plank of wood. But I very quickly discovered why we were carrying a plank of wood, and that was to get over these gullies. So yeah, it is a very dangerous site actually, which is why we certainly never encourage people to go into it, because the mud is very sticky. And I know our ecologist who was doing his PhD, he got stuck in the mud and he lost a welly boot and he never got it back, and he had to drag himself out of the reed beds minus a shoe. So yes, I wouldn't underestimate the hazards within the reed bed for sure.
No, indeed. And you did talk about the ringers going out to the river edge at the end of the dike, and that would be a particularly hazardous bit on the edges.
Yeah, I think if you stay on the dike, you're relatively safe, although it can be quite slippery. But the last time I went to the end of the dike at Tay Lodge was just before New Year. Actually, there's quite a drop off into the mud, and I've never walked on the mud because it just fills me with fear as that I'll never get back out of it again. But yeah, there was just with the water, and obviously the Tay is a very fast moving river, so you don't want to be stuck in the mud for very long before the river comes back in.
Exactly. Yeah. Would you like to stop screen sharing?
Oh yes, sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. Does anybody else want to ask a question? There's something in chat. Let me have a look. Do you have evidence that the Beardies produced later broods after the fire?
Not really. So I'm sure that some of the birds that nested in the area that was burnt probably did try and nest in some of the little patches that weren't burnt, or moved to the areas of reed that weren't affected by the fire. But I think, to be honest, it was as much because it was during the pandemic as well that actually people weren't, the ringers weren't as active, and a lot of the regular activities, made that a lot more difficult to monitor. So, in that year, for a lot of sites that, 2020 is a blank for us. We didn't do a lot of the monitoring that we would have done. So, and in some ways, yeah, it would have been even more important to just get a handle on how the birds did react. So we don't really know, to be honest, is the answer. But I know from speaking to the ringers, or particularly Steve Moyse, who's done a little bit of looking at the data, he does definitely think that the numbers have bounced back. Again, we've not done the full kind of analysis, so it's quite a it's not quite subjective, but it's not an in-depth look at the data to really look at how robust that is. But just a glance at the numbers, it seems like 2021 the numbers were back up, and they had they had made a pretty good recovery by that point.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Anybody else by chat or by unmuting yourself?
Could I ask what you know about the are there any special insects in the reed beds?
Oh, I was hoping you wouldn't ask about insects. No, I'm afraid, certainly in my time, we've not really done very much to look at the invertebrates there. I think Ian did do some as part of his PhD, but we've not done anything since. And I suspect probably when we first were involved with the site in 2005, 2006, that there was a lot more, looking at a whole broad range of kind of groups, including a bit of moth trapping as well. But it's not something that we look at on a regular basis, I'm afraid. So we might have some data in the depths, but we don't do anything, every year. I certainly don't have the expertise to look at it. So if anybody out there wants to come and do some invertebrate sampling at the reed beds, you'd be more than welcome.
Perhaps I could ask again, with bearded tits, you spoke quite a bit about spotting and listening for bearded tits. Have you any more hints on how people might be able to find them? Time of day, perhaps, or time of year, particularly? What would you say so that we can go out there? We can never guarantee you're going to see something, but what's our best chance?
I would say very broad. Go to where the management is. I think Tay Lodge is one of the best bits at the moment. I just had phenomenal views between Christmas and New Year. I have been back since, and it wasn't like that. There were still birds around, but not in the same numbers. I think that's definitely in part because the ringers are down there, and they are baiting up the grit tray. I think it is harder in the spring and the summer because they're not moving in any great numbers. Obviously, once the chicks are fledged, there are more birds around, but the spring is just quite hard because you will see adults up and feeding, but actually, a lot of the time, the birds are incubating as well. So it's just a bit more hit and miss. I always think winter is a better bet. They're moving around in bigger numbers. They tend to be quite vocal as well. And because they're eating kind of the seed as well, although, they are on the ground and you will kind of find them in the bare earth. If you go when the ground is frozen, and obviously it's kind of harder for them to find the seed on the ground, they do kind of sit up higher in the reed beds or in the reeds for longer, and you can get some really just incredible views. So I would definitely say Tay Lodge in the winter when it's a little bit cold, but no guarantees.
No, get out now. Yes.
Yeah, but definitely the managed areas, at any time of the year, I would say, where the blocks are or where you can see the areas have been managed. And there are some really great bits right beside the path. That's definitely kind of your best bet.
Thank you. Anything else? Perhaps a further observation on tackling invasives. You did suggest that you're at the bottom end with river flows bringing everything down. Mm-hmm. Of course, we're on the tidal stretch. So part of the problem is really trying to tackle the whole length, really, isn't it? In fairly time scale, because the seed from your plants will be carried up with the tide as well as being brought down.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, we're definitely within the tidal section, and I think in some ways having it be brackish in somewhere, I think it limits the spread of some of the species, but some of them are just so well established. There has been an area within the Tay Lodge area, actually, just by Errol. So Errol Estate is who owns that bit of ground, and we kind of just manage the reed beds. You know, they have actually done a really good job at managing the Japanese knotweed in the last few years. So they've had quite a big push, but that's in an area that's not really wet. Whereas, you know, it's on the sea wall at Port Allen, the Japanese knotweed, and that's, you know, so I definitely think there's definitely pockets that can be managed. Some of the Himalayan balsam is, I get the impression it was maybe dumped at the top of the bank and it's kind of worked its way down. So there is some that can be tackled, but having spoken to CC, who are kind of looking at a very much a catchment approach, I think their recommendation is just kind of hold off for now, and then when we get, you know, when they get closer to our bit, you know, as with any other landowner, then, you know, there can be a concerted effort to tackle it, rather than, you know, it will maybe take them a couple of years to get there and anything that we've done has kind of reappeared again. But I mean, there is no quick fix for any of these things, unfortunately. So
no, the Himalayan balsam really is all around the edges, and
yeah.
So hopefully the vigor and the depth, the thickness of the reeds would prohibit the Himalayan balsam from getting too far within the beds.
Yeah, I have seen it spread quite far in, because we did go into one section and we tried to, well, at one point we tried to hand pull it, and then we went to brush cut it, just to cut it before it went to seed. But I mean, it's quite difficult to brush cut the reed anyway. But yeah, the amount that we were having to cut just to reach some of the stems within the reed bed, it just, you know, we were going to spend a lot of time actually achieving not very much. So I think if CC can put their weight behind it, and kind of help us, you know, I think that would go a long way to kind of achieving their goals.
Thank you. Any other question? Okay.